Her crimson eyes found Thomas's face. He saved my life by offering connection when I'd resigned myself to dying alone. If that creates vulnerability, then I accept it gladly. Thomas felt emotion rising in his throat, his own or hers, he couldn't quite tell through the bond. Same, he managed. I came to these woods to hide. Maybe what I needed was to be found. Astrid stood, a smile softening her ancient features. I'll leave you two alone. Tomorrow we'll cover vampire physiological needs and weaknesses, things you should know for practical reasons. But tonight I think you've had enough lessons. She moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. Thomas, Seraphine, what you're building here is rare. Possibly unique in the modern age. Protect it. Not just from external threats, but from the fear that will make you question it. The world will tell you this connection is impossible, dangerous, doomed. Don't let the world be right. She left, and silence settled over the cabin. The fire crackled low, casting dancing shadows. Outside, Thomas could hear the distant sound of tribal warriors singing, a haunting harmony that spoke of ancient battles and older loyalties. She's right, Seraphine said softly. It shouldn't work. Every rational part of me says this bond will end badly, that I'm setting both of us up for pain. But every other part, the parts that spent 3 months running alone, the parts that knocked on your door instead of dying quietly in the forest, those parts think maybe rationality is overrated. Thomas turned to face her fully, still holding her hand. I'm scared, he admitted. Of the politics, of the danger, of how much I'm beginning to care about someone I've known less than a week. But I'm also more alive than I've been in years. If that's irrational, then I'm okay being irrational. Seraphine leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, a gesture of intimacy that made the bond sing with resonance. Together then, she whispered. Whatever comes, we face it together. Together, Thomas confirmed. 3 weeks after the dawn of the 200 warriors, the Crystal Courts made their move. Thomas had been expecting diplomats, envoys, perhaps some subtle approach. What he got was spectacle. They arrived at sunset, a delegation of 20 vampires dressed in elaborate finery that made them look like they'd stepped from a Renaissance painting. Where the Bloodwing warriors wore practical armor and tribal marks, these vampires draped themselves in silk and velvet, their faces painted with cosmetics that accentuated rather than hid their supernatural beauty. They moved with choreographed grace, clearly intending to impress through sheer aesthetic overwhelming. At their center walked a vampire who radiated authority despite his slim build and youthful appearance. He looked perhaps 20 in human years, with golden hair styled in meticulous waves, eyes that shifted between blue and violet depending on the light, and features so perfect they crossed into uncanny. He wore robes of deep purple embroidered with silver threads that formed patterns Thomas couldn't quite track. They seemed to shift when he looked away, making his eyes water if he stared too long. Valeria met them at the edge of the clearing, flanked by 50 of her warriors. The contrast was stark. Tribal power versus courtly elegance, martial pragmatism versus aesthetic refinement. Thomas watched from the cabin doorway, Seraphine tense beside him, as the two groups faced each other across 10 feet of neutral ground. Lord Cassius, Valeria said, her tone carrying no warmth. The Crystal Courts grace us with their presence. How unexpected. The golden-haired vampire smiled, and Thomas immediately distrusted it. The expression was too perfect, too calculated. Matriarch Valeria. It's been decades since we've spoken. I'd forgotten how rustic the tribal territories could be. His voice was musical, each word precisely enunciated. We've come to discuss the human under your protection. Thomas Graves, I believe? May we speak with him? You may speak with me first, Valeria replied flatly. State your business. Cassius's smile didn't waver. The Crystal Courts have heard tales of a human invoking the law of sanctuary. Naturally, we're intrigued. Such events are historically significant. We wish merely to meet this Thomas Graves, to understand what occurred, and to offer our assistance navigating the complexities his action has created. Your assistance, Valeria repeated, investing the words with skepticism. How generous. And it has nothing to do with the fact that he's bonded to Seraphine, who your court has marked for execution. Seraphine's situation is a separate matter, Cassius said smoothly. We bear Thomas Graves no ill will. Quite the opposite. We wish to honor his remarkable action. Perhaps even invite him to visit our court, to see the wonders of civilized vampire society. A human who can form genuine bonds would be celebrated among us, not threatened. Celebrated until he's no longer useful, then bound into servitude through contracts he doesn't understand, Valeria countered. The tribes know the Crystal Court's methods, Cassius. We've seen how you honor those who catch your attention. Cassius's pleasant expression finally cracked, irritation flickering through. Are you suggesting we're prisoners of our own protection, matriarch? That we'd harm a human under peace parley? I'm suggesting your definition of harm is flexible enough to include manipulation, coercion, and binding oaths disguised as gifts, Valeria replied. Thomas Graves is under tribal protection. If he wishes to speak with you, that's his choice. But he'll do so here in our territory with our warriors witnessing. No private meetings. No convenient misunderstandings that end with him in your court. Thomas had heard enough. He stepped from the cabin, Seraphine moving with him, and approached the confrontation. 200 pairs of eyes, crimson and violet and every shade between, tracked his movement. The weight of attention should have been crushing, but the bond with Seraphine and the constant presence of tribal warriors had accustomed him to being watched by supernatural beings. I'm Thomas Graves, he announced clearly. You wanted to speak with me, Lord Cassius? Speak. Cassius turned that perfect smile on him, and Thomas felt the force of personality behind it. Centuries of practiced charm focused like a weapon. Mr. Graves, thank you for agreeing to meet. I am Lord Cassius Aurelius, High Chancellor of the Crystal Courts, speaker for the assembled nobility. I've come to offer the courts congratulations on your remarkable action. Invoking the law of sanctuary is no small feat, especially for one unfamiliar with our laws. I didn't invoke anything intentionally, Thomas replied. I just helped someone who needed help. Which makes it all the more remarkable, Cassius purred. Instinctive nobility is rarer than conscious virtue. The courts would like to honor you properly, perhaps host you at our capital. You could see how vampires of refinement live, experience wonders most humans never imagine. We could even arrange safe passage for Seraphine. Her crimes, while serious, might be reconsidered given the new circumstances. Thomas felt Seraphine stiffen beside him, sensed her alarm through the bond. Reconsidered how? He asked carefully. The noble assembly might be persuaded to commute her sentence from execution to exile, Cassius explained, as if offering a generous gift. She would be barred from Crystal Court territories but free to live elsewhere. A fair compromise given the complicated situation. All we'd ask in return is your cooperation in a few small matters. Testimony before the assembly about the bond formation. Perhaps assistance researching ways to recreate such connections under controlled conditions. Nothing burdensome. You want to study me? Thomas translated. Figure out how to reproduce what happened so you can create bonds on your own terms. And you want Seraphine to testify about how she killed your noble, probably recanting her accusations about his crimes. Cassius's smile grew fixed. You misunderstand. We seek knowledge for its own sake and justice tempered with mercy. Seraphine's actions, while extreme, came from understandable anger. Lord Marius was problematic. His removal, though improper in method, solved certain difficulties. We simply wish to move forward productively. Thomas looked at Valeria, who stood with crossed arms and an expression of deep skepticism. He looked at the Bloodwing warriors, silent and ready, their hands never far from weapons. He felt Seraphine's presence through the bond, her fear mixing with defiant anger, her certainty that accepting Cassius's offer would be walking into a trap wrapped in silk and honeyed words. He looked back at Cassius and his elegant delegation, these vampires who'd built a civilization on secrets and careful manipulation, who were trying to absorb him into their world before he could become a threat to their established order. No, Thomas said simply. Cassius blinked, the first genuine expression Thomas had seen from him. No. No, I won't visit your court. No, I won't help you research bonds. No, Seraphine won't testify before your assembly. We're staying here, under tribal protection, and we'll figure out our own future without your interference. Thomas took a step forward, voice hardening. You want to honor me? Honor the reason I invoked your ancient law. I saw someone suffering and chose to help without expectation of reward or complicated political consequences. You want justice? Start by cleaning your own house instead of hunting the person who exposed the rot. Silence crashed over the clearing. Cassius's pleasant mask had completely fallen away, revealing calculation and cold anger beneath. You're making a mistake, Mr. Graves. The crystal quartz are the dominant power among vampire kind. Refusing our friendship is short-sighted. Is that a threat? Valeria asked, her voice deadly quiet. An observation, Cassius replied, recovering his composure. The Bloodwing tribes are formidable, but they're not everywhere. They can't protect Thomas Graves indefinitely. Eventually he'll need to interact with the wider world, vampire and human. When that happens, having the crystal quartz as enemies will make his life considerably more difficult. When that happens, Valeria said, he'll have the full weight of tribal protection backing him. Not just my warriors but the entire Bloodwing nation. We number in the thousands, Lord Cassius, and we don't play the political games your courts are so fond of. If you move against Thomas Graves or Seraphine, we'll respond. Not with diplomacy or legal maneuvering, but with the methods that made humans fear the night for 10,000 years before your courts decided civilization was more important than honor. Cassius stared at the matriarch, and for a moment Thomas saw genuine emotion cross his face. Frustration, anger, and perhaps a touch of fear. The crystal quartz might be more numerous and politically powerful, but they were also soft compared to the tribal warriors. In a direct conflict, Valeria's forces would be devastating. The courts will remember this, Cassius said finally, directing the words at Thomas. We offered friendship. You chose tribal savagery over civilized cooperation. Don't come seeking our mercy when you realize your mistake. I won't, Thomas replied. And for the record? Your civilized cooperation looked a lot like trying to control me through manipulation and implied threats. I'll take honest warriors over dishonest diplomats any day. Cassius turned without another word, his delegation following in choreographed precision. They vanished into the forest, heading back toward whatever portal or transportation had brought them to tribal territory. As they disappeared, Thomas felt tension bleeding out of the assembled warriors, though they didn't relax their guard. Valeria approached, her expression mixing approval with concern. You've made a powerful enemy, Thomas Graves. The crystal courts don't forget slights, especially public ones. Had I accepted his offer, would I actually be any safer? Thomas asked. No, Valeria admitted. You'd have traded immediate danger for slower, more insidious threats. They'd have bound you in contracts and obligations until you forgot what freedom looked like. Seraphine would have disappeared during testimony, probably killed quietly, and the bond used to manipulate you through grief. The matriarch's respect was evident in her tone. You saw through the performance. Not many humans could resist that level of focused charm from someone like Cassius. I've dealt with recruiters before, Thomas said dryly. Military, corporate, religious, they all use the same basic techniques. Promise everything, deliver control, and act offended when you notice the strings attached. Seraphine stepped closer, her hand finding his. Through the bond, he felt her relief and fierce pride. Thank you, she said quietly, for not selling me to my executioners wrapped in false mercy. We're in this together, Thomas reminded her. That means something. I'm not abandoning you to political convenience. Astrid emerged from the warrior ranks, her expression thoughtful. The crystal quartz will escalate now. That refusal was public, witnessed by both sides. Cassius can't let it stand without responding. He'd lose face among the nobility. Expect more direct approaches. Attempts to isolate you, target your human connections, maybe even hire hunters outside vampire society to circumvent tribal protection. Then we prepare, Valeria declared. Double the patrols. Full alert status. And Thomas? She fixed him with her crimson stare. No more solo trips into the woods. If you leave the cabin, you do so with escort. The tribes protect our own, and you've firmly established yourself as one of ours by choosing our honest threat over their false promise. Over the following days, tension ratcheted higher. Tribal scouts reported Crystal Court agents moving through nearby territories, watching, gathering information. Thomas's cabin became a fortress, constantly guarded, with warriors rotating through in shifts that never left him unprotected. He continued his education with Astrid, learning combat techniques that might help against vampire attackers, studying vampire weaknesses that seemed disturbingly extensive once you knew what to look for. Seraphine, meanwhile, had begun accepting Valeria's standing offer. She started training with tribal warriors, learning their combat methods, slowly being integrated into the Bloodwing culture. Thomas watched her transform over those weeks, the frightened exile becoming something fiercer, more certain. She'd always been strong, he realized, but Crystal Court society had taught her to hide that strength behind scholarship and deference. The tribes taught her to embrace it instead. The bond between them continued deepening, becoming less a separate thing and more an integrated part of how they experienced reality. Thomas found he could sense Seraphine's location instinctively, knew her emotional state even across distances. Dreams began bleeding together. He'd wake with memories of flying, while she'd mention dreams of human experiences she'd never personally lived. Astrid called it unprecedented, a connection reaching depths she'd only read about in ancient texts. "You're becoming something new," she told them one evening, her voice mixing awe with concern. "Not quite human, not quite vampire, but bonded in ways that transcend both." The old stories spoke of such pairs, champions who could stand between worlds, who belonged fully to neither side and therefore could bridge them. "I always thought they were myths, but watching you too," she trailed off, shaking her head. "The Crystal Courts are right to fear you, even if their methods of addressing that fear are contemptible. You represent change they can't control." 6 weeks after the tribal warriors first surrounded his cabin, Valeria invited Thomas and Seraphine to attend the Blood Moon Festival, a gathering of the Bloodwing tribes that occurred once every decade. Thomas understood this was an honor and a test, the tribes accepting them while also demonstrating the full scope of what he'd accidentally allied himself with. They traveled through the forest for 2 days, accompanied by an escort of 50 warriors. The journey took them deep into wilderness that probably hadn't seen human presence in centuries, through valleys where mist never fully lifted and over mountains whose peaks seemed to touch the clouds. Thomas, as the only human, required frequent breaks and assistance over difficult terrain, but the warriors were patient, treating his limitations with respect rather than contempt. The festival site stole his breath when they finally arrived. A vast clearing stretched between ancient trees, and within it, thousands of vampires had gathered. Not the elaborate elegance of Crystal Courts, but raw power barely contained, warriors from dozens of tribes, their armor and markings reflecting different traditions but united by martial culture. Banners flew from wooden poles, depicting tribal symbols and blood-red dye. Fires burned in massive pits, more for ceremony than warmth, casting dancing shadows that made the entire gathering look like something from prehistory. At the clearing center stood a structure that looked like it had grown from the earth rather than been built. A massive arch of intertwined wood and stone, covered with carvings that hurt Thomas's eyes when he tried to focus on them. Valeria explained it was the Blood Gate, a portal maintained through ancient magic that allowed tribes to gather despite being scattered across continents. The festival was one of the few times it opened, making this assembly a rare convergence of vampire warrior culture. "There are humans here," Thomas observed with surprise, spotting a handful of non-vampire figures moving among the crowds. "Blood friends," Valeria explained. "Like you. Humans who've earned tribal protection through significant actions. Some are decades old, aging naturally while maintaining their bonds with vampire companions. Others are newer, still adjusting to their status. You'll find you have more in common with them than you might expect." Indeed, Thomas was introduced to several other blood friends over the first evening. A woman named Catherine who'd saved a tribal warrior from a silver trap 15 years prior, a man called James who'd fought alongside warriors against rogue vampires threatening his village, even an elderly scholar named Marcus who'd helped preserve tribal histories when they were nearly lost. Each had their own story of how mercy, courage, or simple human decency had forged connections across species lines. "You're already legendary among us," Catherine told him with a smile. She appeared to be in her 40s, carrying herself with the confidence of someone comfortable in her unusual role. A human invoking the law of sanctuary is the kind of tale tribal grandmothers tell children. Except you actually did it, and you bonded with an exile from the crystal courts, and you publicly refused Lord Cassius himself. You've had more adventure in 6 weeks than most of us experience in years. "Lucky me," Thomas said dryly, though he found himself enjoying the company. These were people who understood the strangeness of standing between worlds, who'd navigated the same complicated territory he was only beginning to explore. The festival itself was a spectacle beyond anything Thomas had imagined. Tribal warriors competed in contests of skill, aerial combat demonstrations that turned the sky into a battlefield of wheeling forms, ground fighting with weapons and without, endurance challenges that would have killed humans in minutes. There were ceremonies honoring fallen warriors, their names chanted by thousands of voices in harmonies that seemed to resonate with the earth itself. Stories were told around the fires, ancient tales of when vampires and humans fought together against threats now lost to history. Seraphine stayed close to Thomas, her hand often finding his, the bond between them a constant warm presence. He could sense her emotional response to the festival, awe at the raw power on display, wistful longing for community she'd never known in the crystal courts, and fierce belonging as if she'd found something she didn't know she'd been searching for. Several tribal warriors approached her during the gathering, welcoming her, sharing combat techniques, treating her as one of their own rather than an outsider. On the second night, during the height of the blood moon's rise, a lunar eclipse that painted the clearing in crimson light, Valeria called for silence. Thousands of vampires ceased their activities, turning toward the blood gate where the matriarch stood flanked by other tribal leaders. "We gather under the blood moon," Valeria's voice rang out, "to honor our traditions, remember our fallen, and celebrate what it means to be warriors in a world that has forgotten the old ways. Tonight, we have among us something unprecedented. A human who invoked the law of sanctuary, who reminded us that the ancient bonds can still be forged." Thomas Graves approached the blood gate. Thomas felt every eye turn to him. Through the bond, he sensed Seraphine's encouragement mixed with her own nervousness about what was coming. Astrid gave him a small nod from where she stood among Valeria's lieutenants. Taking a breath, Thomas walked through the crowd toward the arch, thousands of vampires parting silently to let him pass. He stood before the blood gate, facing Valeria and the assembled tribal leaders. The matriarch's expression was serious, formal in a way he'd rarely seen from her. "Thomas Graves," she began, "you have lived among us for 6 weeks. You've studied our ways, defended our values, refused corruption from those who would make you their tool. You've bonded with Seraphine, who even now trains to become a true warrior of the tribes. You've treated warriors who could end you with a gesture as equals deserving respect. You've asked for nothing, expected no special treatment, and shown courage in facing consequences you never sought." She paused, letting silence build. "The Bloodwing tribes wish to honor you. Not as a curiosity, not as a symbol, but as one who has earned respect through deed and character. We offer you title and status. Blood friend of the tribes, bearer of the sanctuary rite, human who walks between worlds. This is not empty ceremony. It means every tribe here pledges their protection to you. It means your name will be entered in our histories, remembered as long as warriors gather under blood moons. It means you are ours and we are yours, bound by oaths older than cities." Valeria stepped forward, withdrawing from her belt a knife carved from dark wood with a blade of what looked like crystallized blood. "It requires only that you accept willingly, understanding the responsibilities it carries. You will be called upon, Thomas Graves. When conflicts arise between our peoples, you may be asked to mediate. When misunderstandings threaten violence, you may be asked to bridge divides. When humans need reminding that not all vampires are monsters, or when vampires need reminding that humans are more than prey, you may be asked to stand witness to better possibilities." Thomas looked at the assembled thousands, These warriors who'd accepted him with a strange combination of ferocity and gentleness. He felt Seraphine through the bond, her presence an anchor and a promise. He thought about his life before, the isolation, the slow withering of spirit disguised as peace. Then he thought about the past 6 weeks, terrifying, confusing, exhausting, and more genuinely alive than anything he'd experienced in years. I accept, he said clearly, with understanding that I'm just one human with limits and flaws, but willing to do what I can to honor the trust you're placing in me. Valeria smiled, genuine warmth breaking through her formal demeanor. Then by the authority vested in me as matriarch, by the witness of the assembled tribes, under the light of the blood moon, I name you Thomas Graves, blood friend to the nations, bearer of the sanctuary rite, human who walks between worlds. May your enemies know fear, may your allies know loyalty, may the old bonds never again be forgotten while your name is remembered. She took his hand, drew the ceremonial knife across his palm, a sharp, clean cut, then across her own. They clasped hands, blood mingling, and Thomas felt something shift in the fabric of reality. It wasn't the same as his bond with Seraphine, but similar, a connection forming, spreading from Valeria through the assembled thousands like ripples in water. He could feel their presence now, not as individuals but as a collective force, an ancient power that had just acknowledged him as part of itself. The tribes erupted in the same rhythmic striking of weapons against shields that had greeted him when Valeria first declared protection. But this was louder, thousands of warriors creating a thunderous drumbeat that echoed through the forest and seemed to shake the stars themselves. Seraphine was suddenly there, embracing him, and through their bond he felt her joy and fierce pride mixing with his own overwhelming emotion. "You've done it," she whispered against his shoulder. "You've actually bridged 2 worlds. They love you, Thomas. These ancient warriors who've forgotten how to trust, they love you." The festival continued through the night, but Thomas found himself surrounded by well-wishers, warriors offering respect, other blood friends welcoming him to their unique fellowship, even tribal elders sharing stories of the last time a human had been honored this way, centuries ago in conflicts now lost to history. Catherine approached with Marcus, the elderly scholar, both smiling broadly. "Welcome to the strangest club in existence," Marcus said, his eyes twinkling with humor and something deeper, satisfaction at not being alone in his unusual status. "Fair warning, once the crystal courts hear about this ceremony, they're going to lose their collective minds. You've just been formally adopted by their greatest rivals." "Let them rage," Catherine added. "The tribes don't bluff and they don't abandon their own. You're safer now than you've ever been, even if you've also painted a larger target on yourself." Thomas understood both truths. He'd gained powerful allies, but he'd also committed himself to conflicts he barely understood. Yet standing there with Seraphine at his side, surrounded by warriors who'd accepted him despite every rational reason not to, watching the blood moon paint everything in shades of crimson promise, he found he had no regrets. This was what he'd been searching for in his isolation. Not escape from complications, but meaningful connection worth the complications it created. He tried to hide from a broken world. Instead, he'd found a way to start mending it, one impossible relationship at a time. The journey back to the cabin took 3 days, slowed by the careful travel required for Thomas's human limitations. But the pace allowed him to process everything: the festival, the ceremony, the weight of titles and responsibilities he'd somehow acquired. Seraphine traveled beside him, their bond humming with comfortable resonance, occasionally sharing impressions of what they'd witnessed without needing words. "Do you regret it?" she asked on the second day as they rested beside a stream that cut through ancient forest. "Everything that's happened? Your quiet life is gone, probably permanently. You're entangled in politics you never wanted, bonded to a vampire, adopted by tribal warriors. If you'd closed your door that night, you'd still have your solitude." Thomas considered the question seriously, watching sunlight filter through leaves in patterns that reminded him of the stained glass windows from a church he'd attended as a child. "I was dying in that solitude," he finally said. "Slowly, quietly, but dying nonetheless. You don't save a life by preserving it in amber, you save it by giving it reasons to keep living. You knocked on my door, Seraphine, but maybe I needed someone to knock. Maybe I was waiting for an excuse to rejoin the world, even if that world turned out to be stranger than I'd imagined. That's unexpectedly philosophical, Seraphine said, a smile playing at her lips. I've had time to think while marching through wilderness surrounded by vampire warriors. Tends to prompt introspection. Thomas reached out, taking her hand in his now familiar gesture. I don't regret you if that's what you're asking. The bond, the complications, the danger, none of it changes that helping you was the first thing I'd done in years that felt right in a way that transcended logic. Seraphine's crimson eyes held his, and through the bond he felt her emotions, relief, affection, gratitude, and something deeper that neither of them had named yet but both recognized. I don't regret you either, she said softly. Even though you're frustratingly noble, stubborn to the point of self-destruction, and apparently incapable of seeing yourself the way others see you. The tribes don't honor humans for being ordinary, Thomas. They saw in you what I saw that first night. Someone who makes the right choice even when it costs them, who treats mercy as duty rather than sentiment. That's rare. Precious. Worth protecting. They returned to the cabin to find it exactly as they'd left it, though the surrounding forest felt different, more alive, more watchful. Thomas realized the tribal patrols had become so integrated into the environment that he now perceived their absence as wrongness rather than their presence as intrusion. Astrid was waiting, along with a rotating guard of 20 warriors who'd maintained the perimeter during the festival. Welcome back, blood friend, Astrid greeted with a smile that mixed respect and amusement. I trust the festival was enlightening? Overwhelming, Thomas admitted. Also incredible, terrifying, and strangely moving. I'm still processing most of it. You'll be processing for months, Astrid assured him. But there are more immediate concerns. Crystal Court agents have been probing the perimeter, not attacking but testing our responses, mapping our patrol patterns. They're planning something. Cassius doesn't forgive public humiliation, and your ceremony at the Blood Moon Festival will have reached him by now. Every vampire within 100 miles could sense the surge when Valeria bound you to the tribes. So what do we do? Seraphine asked, her hand instinctively moving to the weapon she'd been training with, a tribal blade given to her by one of Valeria's lieutenants. We prepare, Astrid replied. And we wait. The crystal courts are predictable in their unpredictability. They'll try something clever, something that circumvents direct confrontation with the tribes while still achieving their goals. The question is what form that cleverness takes. The answer came 2 days later, and it was crueler than Thomas had anticipated. He woke before dawn to find Astrid standing over him, her expression grim. Thomas, you need to see this. She handed him a tablet, modern technology looking surreal in his rustic cabin, displaying a news article. The headline made his blood run cold. Missing hermit's family seeks answers. Local man's strange disappearance prompts search. Thomas read with growing horror. The article claimed his family had reported him missing months ago, that search parties had been dispatched, that concerns were growing about his mental state before the disappearance. There were interviews with people he barely remembered, distant relatives, former co-workers, all expressing worry and confusion. His cabin's location had been discovered, and authorities were planning a welfare check. It's fabricated, Astrid said. Or heavily manipulated. The crystal courts have resources, money, influence in human institutions. They're forcing a situation where human authorities come looking for you, and when they find you alive and well, you'll need to explain your prolonged absence. And anything I say that's truthful sounds insane, Thomas finished, understanding the trap. If I tell them I've been living in the woods bonded to a vampire and adopted by tribal warriors, I get committed. If I lie and say I was just camping, they ask why I didn't notify anyone. If I resist or disappear again, they paint me as mentally unstable and dangerous. Worse, Seraphine added, her voice tight with anger. They'll use your instability to discredit anything you might say about vampire society. If Thomas Graves is a mentally disturbed hermit who believes in fantasy creatures, then Thomas Graves can't serve as a bridge between worlds. They neutralize you through character assassination. Thomas felt cold calculation settling over him, the same mental state that had kept him alive through ambushes and firefights. When are the authorities coming? Tomorrow morning, Astrid replied. We have perhaps 12 hours to decide how to handle this. Valeria arrived within the hour, her presence confirming the severity of the situation. The matriarch looked furious in a cold, controlled way that was somehow more terrifying than overt rage. The crystal courts have overstepped, she said flatly. Involving human authorities, potentially exposing our existence through bureaucratic investigation, it violates the same secrecy they claim to protect. They're desperate and making reckless moves. Can you stop the authorities from coming? Thomas asked. We could, Valeria admitted, but that would only confirm their concerns. Witnesses reporting strange activity, a missing person who resists rescue, it would spiral into exactly the media attention the crystal courts want to create. No, we need a different approach. We need you to handle the human authorities, prove you're sane and stable, and shut down this angle of attack. How? Thomas asked. What explanation doesn't make me sound delusional? The truth, Seraphine said suddenly, everyone turning to look at her. Not about vampires but about why you're here. You're a veteran dealing with war trauma who needed isolation to heal. You came to these woods deliberately, left your old life behind consciously, and you've been living peacefully on your own property. You don't owe anyone explanations about your life choices. But the missing person report will turn out to be mistaken or malicious, Astrid interrupted, catching on to Seraphine's logic. You're not missing, you're deliberately isolated. You have witnesses who can confirm you've been here continuously. Human witnesses, Seraphine stressed. The other blood friends. Catherine, James, Marcus, they can visit, confirm they've been checking on you periodically, establish that you're part of a small community of people who prefer wilderness living. Nothing supernatural, just humans choosing alternative lifestyles. Thomas felt hope stirring. That could work. I am a veteran, that's documented. I did choose to leave, that's verifiable. And if I have regular visitors who can testify I'm stable and lucid. The crystal court's narrative collapses, Valeria finished, a fierce smile crossing her features. They were counting on you being isolated, with no human connections to contradict their story. But you're not isolated anymore. You're part of something, both the tribal protection and the Blood Friend Fellowship. We used that. The next 12 hours were a flurry of activity. Catherine, James, and Marcus were contacted and transported to the cabin with supernatural speed. They arrived with supplies, personal gear, and stories coordinated to be truthful while carefully omitting supernatural elements. Catherine had been bringing supplies monthly. James had helped Thomas with cabin repairs. Marcus had shared books and conversation during his visits. All true, all documentable, all perfectly mundane explanations for why a hermit might have regular visitors without being missing. Thomas cleaned himself up, made sure the cabin looked lived in rather than abandoned, and prepared his story. He was a veteran, honorably discharged, who'd used his savings to buy remote property and pursue self-sufficiency. He'd maintained minimal contact with civilization by choice, not because of instability. Yes, he'd distanced himself from his family, that was part of his healing process. No, he hadn't considered that they might file a missing person report because he'd left clear documentation of his intentions. When the authorities arrived, 2 sheriff's deputies and a social worker, Thomas met them calmly at the property line, flanked by Catherine and James. The deputies were polite but clearly skeptical, having driven hours into wilderness following GPS coordinates and increasingly difficult trails. Mr. Graves? The senior deputy asked. Thomas Graves? That's me, Thomas confirmed. I understand there's been some confusion about my whereabouts? The social worker, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stepped forward. Mr. Graves, your family filed a missing person report 6 months ago. They've been very worried. Can you tell us why you haven't been in contact? Thomas explained clearly and calmly. His service, his struggles with returning to civilian life, his decision to pursue healing through isolation and wilderness living. He showed them his property deed, his veteran's identification, supplies that demonstrated long-term habitation. Catherine and James provided testimonials, establishing that he'd had regular human contact and hadn't been isolated to a dangerous degree. But your family, the social worker began. I love my family, Thomas said, and that was true, even if that love was complicated by distance and misunderstanding. But they didn't understand what I needed to heal. They wanted me to slot back into my old life, see therapists, take medications, be the person I was before deployment. I needed space to figure out who I am now, after war, after everything I saw and did. I left documentation of my intentions, my location, everything. If they filed a missing person report, it was because they were ignoring what I clearly communicated about my choices. The deputies exchanged glances, their initial concern visibly shifting to understanding. They were professionals, but they were also human beings who could recognize a veteran seeking peace rather than a mentally disturbed individual. The senior deputy nodded slowly. Mr. Graves, I'll be honest. This looks like a case of family not accepting your decision rather than you being in danger. You're clearly lucid, your living situation is unusual but not illegal, and you have witnesses confirming you're not isolated. He paused. We'll need to file a report confirming we've located you and assessed your well-being. Is there anything you want conveyed to your family? Thomas considered carefully. Tell them I'm safe, I'm healthy, and I'm living the life I need to live. I hope someday they'll understand, but I can't force that understanding. And tell them, he hesitated, emotion catching in his throat, tell them I appreciate their concern even if it was misplaced. The authorities left an hour later, their report essentially closing the missing person case. Thomas watched them drive away, feeling tension he hadn't fully acknowledged finally bleeding out of his muscles. Catherine clapped him on the shoulder. Well done, she said approvingly. You handled that like someone who's had practice being interrogated. Military training has unexpected applications, Thomas replied with a weak smile. Think the crystal quartz will try something else? Absolutely, Astrid answered, emerging from where she'd been watching unseen from the forest. But this particular gambit has failed spectacularly. They tried to use human systems against you and discovered you have more human connections than they'd anticipated. They're learning that you're not the isolated hermit they assumed, that you've built something here, a community that spans both worlds. Valeria appeared beside Astrid, her sudden materialization no longer startling Thomas the way it had weeks ago. The crystal quartz are resourceful, but they're also increasingly desperate. Each failed attempt makes them look weaker, which is dangerous. Desperate vampires make catastrophic decisions. We need to shift from defensive postures to establishing your legitimacy more broadly. What did you have in mind? Seraphine asked. A council, Valeria said. Neutral ground, all major vampire factions represented, with Thomas and Seraphine present to tell their story directly. No more letting the crystal quartz control the narrative. We force a public accounting of what happened. The bond formation, Seraphine's justified killing of Lord Marius, Thomas's invocation of ancient law, and the tribe's recognition of his status. Put everything in open forum where witnesses from all factions can judge for themselves. The crystal courts would never agree to that, Astrid protested. They will if the Court of Eternal Night demands it, Valeria countered. The Eternal Night serves as arbitrators for conflicts between vampire factions. They're sworn to neutrality, maintaining territory specifically designated for dispute resolution. If we petition them formally, citing the crystal court's escalating harassment and the historical significance of Thomas's situation, they'll call a council. It's their purpose, preventing vampire civil wars by providing forums for grievance resolution. Thomas absorbed this, recognizing the strategic shift. You want to turn this from a conflict into a trial. Put the crystal courts on record defending their actions against someone under tribal protection. Let all vampire society see what they've been doing. Exactly, Valeria confirmed. The crystal courts thrive on secrecy and control. Forcing them into open forum with neutral witnesses removes their primary advantages. They'll have to justify executing Seraphine for killing a noble who was committing atrocities. They'll have to explain why they've been harassing a human protected by ancient law. They'll have to defend actions that look increasingly unjustifiable under scrutiny. It's risky, Seraphine said carefully. The Court of Eternal Night is neutral, but they're also conservative. They might rule that my execution should proceed, that bonds with humans should be forbidden, that Thomas's status doesn't override established precedent. We could lose everything. We could, Valeria agreed. But we could also win recognition that changes vampire society fundamentally. The old laws exist, Thomas proved they can be invoked, and now we have the opportunity to force acknowledgement that those laws still carry weight. Even the Court of Eternal Night can't ignore that without undermining their own authority. Thomas looked at Seraphine, their bond carrying his question. What do you think? He felt her response. Fear mixed with hope, understanding that staying defensive meant living under constant threat, but going offensive meant risking catastrophic loss. We do it, Thomas decided. We've been reacting to their moves. Time to make them react to ours. If we're going to be historical figures, we might as well be active participants in writing that history rather than passive subjects of someone else's narrative. Seraphine squeezed his hand, her smile fierce despite the fear he could sense through their bond. Together then. Into the council whatever comes. Together, Thomas confirmed and sealed it with the only oath that had ever truly mattered to him. The promise to stand beside someone when standing alone would be easier, to choose connection over safety, to believe that even impossible things could be made real through the simple act of refusing to accept impossibility. The Council of Eternal Night convened 3 months after Thomas first opened his door to a dying vampire. It was held in neutral territory, ancient ruins in what had once been called the heart of Europe, now maintained by the Court of Eternal Night as sacred ground where vampire law had been administered for millennia. Thomas stood with Seraphine in a vast chamber carved from living stone, surrounded by representatives from every major vampire faction. The crystal courts in their elaborate finery, the blood-winged tribes in their martial armor, the crimson monks in their ascetic robes, the solitary ones who attended despite their distaste for politics, and dozens of other groups he'd learned about through Astrid's intensive education. At the chamber's center sat the 3 judges of the Eternal Night, ancient vampires whose ages made even Valeria look young, creatures who remembered when Rome was young and Christianity was a cult. They listened to testimony for 6 hours. Seraphine describing Lord Marius's crimes and her decision to end him, Thomas explaining his choice to offer blood and the bond that formed, Valeria recounting the tribal recognition and the law of sanctuary, witnesses from all sides presenting evidence and precedent. The crystal courts argued that Seraphine had violated their laws regardless of justification, that bonds with humans were dangerous precedents that threatened the separation keeping both species safe, that Thomas was a well-meaning human who didn't understand the forces he'd unleashed. Lord Cassius presented their case with eloquent fury, painting Thomas and Seraphine as dangerous radicals whose actions threatened stability maintained across centuries. But the blood-winged tribes countered with their own witnesses, Catherine, James, Marcus, and other blood friends demonstrating that connections between species hadn't created the catastrophes the crystal courts predicted. They presented historical documents proving the law of sanctuary had been fundamental to vampire society before the separation, that bonds like Thomas and Seraphine's were features rather than bugs of the ancient system. And then Thomas spoke. Not as a politician or scholar, but as a man who'd simply tried to help someone and found himself caught in conflicts spanning millennia. He spoke about mercy as instinct rather than calculation, about choosing connection despite danger, about refusing to let fear of consequences prevent doing what felt right in the moment. He spoke about veterans learning to live with impossible memories, about isolation as slow death, about finding unexpected salvation in the form of crimson eyes and desperate need. I don't understand your laws, Thomas told the assembled council, his voice carrying through the ancient chamber. I don't understand your politics or your history beyond what I've frantically studied these past months. But I understand that every choice that matters, every real choice, comes down to whether you treat the being in front of you as a person or a problem. Seraphine was dying. She was also a person. That's all the understanding I needed. If your laws punish me for that, then your laws are broken and need changing. Silence filled the chamber. The judges conferred in a language so old Thomas couldn't identify it, their deliberations taking form in whispers that seemed to echo from the stones themselves. Finally, the eldest judge, a woman whose age defied calculation, whose eyes held the weight of watching civilizations rise and fall, spoke. The council rules as follows. Seraphine of the Crystal Courts acted outside established law but within ancient right when she ended Lord Marius. Her actions, while irregular, fulfilled the deeper purpose of vampire law, protecting the balance that keeps our existence sustainable. Her exile from Crystal Court territories will stand, but her sentence of execution is commuted. She is free to join any faction that will accept her. Seraphine's hand gripped Thomas's with sudden force, relief flooding through the bond so powerfully it made him dizzy. The judge continued, Thomas Graves, human, has indeed invoked the law of sanctuary. This council recognizes that the bond formed was legitimate, formed through free choice and genuine mercy. The Bloodwing tribe's recognition of his status is valid. However, the judge's ancient eyes fixed on Thomas. The council also rules that such bonds, while legal, must remain voluntary and informed on both sides. Thomas Graves may not be compelled to maintain his bond or status if he chooses release. Similarly, Seraphine may not be bound against her will. This is fundamental. The old laws required choice, not coercion. Choice is what makes these bonds sacred. We choose to maintain the bond, Thomas and Seraphine said simultaneously, their voices overlapping. A slight smile crossed the ancient judge's face. So witnessed. Finally, this council rules that the Crystal Court's harassment of one under tribal protection violated established precedent. They are fined and formally censured. Any further actions against Thomas Graves or Seraphine will be treated as direct assault on the Court of Eternal Night's authority and dealt with accordingly. Lord Cassius looked like he'd swallowed poison, but he bowed his head in acceptance. The ruling was final, backed by authority even the Crystal Courts couldn't ignore. As the council adjourned, Thomas felt Seraphine's joy and relief through the bond, mixing with his own overwhelming sense of validation. They'd won. Not completely, there would still be enemies, still be challenges, but they'd won recognition, legitimacy, protection under law that couldn't be easily dismissed. Valeria approached, her expression mixing satisfaction with respect. You did well, Thomas Graves. Both of you. The council's ruling changes everything. Bonds between humans and vampires are now recognized as legal across all factions. You've rewritten centuries of precedent by simply refusing to accept that mercy requires permission. What happens now? Thomas asked. Now. Valeria smiled. Now you live. You return to your cabin if you wish, or you travel, or you continue building whatever it is you're creating with Seraphine. The tribes will maintain their protection, but perhaps more importantly, you no longer need constant guarding. You're recognized by the highest authority in vampire society. That recognition is armor stronger than any warrior could provide. They returned to the cabin a week later, exhausted but triumphant. The tribal warriors had maintained the property, but Valeria was calling them back to their regular territories, no longer necessary as constant guards, though patrols would continue periodically to honor their commitment. Thomas stood in the clearing that had once represented isolation and now represented connection, looking at the cabin that had transformed from a hideout into a home. What do you want to do? Seraphine asked, standing beside him. Now that we have choice instead of just survival? Thomas considered the question. I want to help, he decided. Other humans who might encounter vampires who want to connect with humans but don't know how, blood friends who need community and education. There's a role here, bridge building, translation between worlds, helping both sides remember they're not as separate as they've convinced themselves. He looked at her, this impossible being who'd knocked on his door and changed everything. If you're interested in that kind of work? Always, Seraphine replied. I was an archivist who loved preserving history. Maybe I can help create history worth preserving. A future where the separation gradually heals, where bonds like ours become common rather than exceptional. It's ambitious enough to be laughable, but then again, everything about us is laughable by previous standards. They stood together as dawn broke over the forest, the light painting everything in shades of gold and promise. 200 tribal warriors had once surrounded this cabin, witnessing an impossibility. Now it was just the two of them, human and vampire, bonded by blood and choice and something deeper that transcended both, standing at the beginning of whatever came next. Together, Thomas said, not a question but a reaffirmation. Together, Seraphine agreed. Always. And in the growing light of a new day, in a clearing that had witnessed miracles born from simple mercy, they began to plan a future that shouldn't have been possible but now seemed inevitable. A bridge between worlds built one impossible connection at a time, starting with the night a human gave blood to a thirsty vampire and changed the course of history through the radical act of choosing compassion over fear.